From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Wednesday, August 9. It's the case that wrecks the lives of everyone it touches and spawns a seemingly never-ending cascade of legal action.
His reputation battered, his career over.
It's a case that seemingly has no winners, and the fallout from the aborted Parliament House rape trial is continuing with damning findings.
Such is the reputational damage and emotional devastation that has ensued since Brittany Higgins alleged that Bruce Lerhmann, her former Liberal staffer colleague, raped her in Parliament House. Lerhmann has always strenuously denied the accusation. His trial was aborted, but the case has just taken out two high-profile people. Last week, it was Shane Drumgold, the ACT's Director of Public Prosecutions. Then, on Monday, it was the former Supreme Court Judge, Walter Sofronoff. Today, senior writer Jacqueline Maley on how an inquiry into this trial, which was hoped would spearhead an overhaul of parliamentary culture, has gone so terribly wrong. So, Jacqueline, many readers may be vaguely familiar with the name Shane Drumgold, possibly aware that he was central in the trial last year against Bruce Lerhmann. But who is Shane Drumgold, and why in the last week did he go from prosecuting people who end up on the cover of newspapers to being the person on the cover himself?
Yeah, well, this is just sort of one part of the extraordinary nature of this entire matter of the prosecution of Bruce Lerhmann for the rape of Brittany Higgins, which allegedly occurred in 2019 and is still rolling on. Shane Drumgold is now former chief prosecutor of the ACT, so he's the guy at the top of the tree charged with, upholding the criminal justice system. As the most high-profile and senior prosecutor, he took on the case of prosecuting Bruce Lerhmann for the alleged rape of Brittany Higgins, and that trial, of course, was famously aborted last year after juror misconduct, and a retrial was abandoned because of what Shane Drumgold said was the risk to Brittany Higgins' mental health, because she was in a very fragile state at the time. So, the trial sort of collapsed, and then there was a lot of recriminations between Shane Drumgold, so the sort of prosecution arm of the government, and the investigating police. And it became clear that there was a lot of tension between the two, and that the police, basically, who were tasked with investigating the matter, a lot of them thought that it should never have been brought to trial. And Shane Drumgold, who has said that he has a very strong sort of social justice bent, and he believes that the criminal justice system is really weighted against rape complainants, felt very strongly that this case should go ahead, and he prosecuted it. However, having called for an inquiry into the investigation and the prosecution of the whole matter after it collapsed, he has now been the only head that's been claimed by the inquiry.
After 4 years, Shane Drumgold is no longer the ACT's Director of Public Prosecutions.
A leaked report into the handling of the Bruce Lerhmann and Brittany Higgins case, allegedly finding Shane Drumgold lied and abused his authority.
Shane Drumgold was really left in an untenable position, so he handed in his resignation to the ACT government last week.
So, Jacqueline, can you remind us briefly just how messy it got and what sort of led Shane Drumgold to really want this inquiry in the first place?
Well, Shane Drumgold, after the trial collapsed and there was clearly tension between himself and the police, he made some quite extraordinary claims about political interference, and he said that there were sort of he intimated that there were darker political forces at play during the trial.
Some of the questions in my mind, hypothetically, was this at the time a government minister exerting pressure through the Federal Commissioner onto ACT policing to make a matter go away?
And as we know, of course, the entire matter was always inextricably sort of bound up in politics, because it allegedly happened in Parliament House. It allegedly happened on the couch of the ministerial office where both the complainant and the defendant were working at the time. So Drumgold sort of made these claims of political interference very airily. He didn't have anything to back them up, and he very much walked them back during the inquiry.
Acknowledge that your suspicions about the existence of political interference to prevent the case properly going ahead were mistaken?
I do accept that.
And it was clear that the police did not have a lot of confidence in Drumgold. Drumgold also said that the police had colluded or sort of had inappropriate interactions with the defence team during the trial. And even extraordinarily, when Linda Reynolds, the former minister in whose office this rape allegedly occurred, when she was on the stand, he put to her some very sort of strong suggestions that she had behaved inappropriately by contacting the defence, and also, he said, by arranging for her partner to be in the courtroom, with the implication that, you know, the partner was going to sort of take down evidence and then relay it back to Linda Reynolds. So they were all very strong claims to make, and these are some of the claims that he was heavily criticised for in the inquiry report, which came out officially on Monday.
Okay, and so we'll get into that in a moment. But like you said, he passionately demanded this inquiry happen. And like you said, he's the only head that's rolled as a result. So can you tell us about this report? What were its findings?
Basically, the findings are extremely critical. Like, they absolutely excoriate Shane Drumgold and his conduct. And on a number of matters, Walter Sofronoff, the head of the inquiry, found that Shane Drumgold had been grossly unethical. Most sort of severely, I suppose, he found that Shane Drumgold misled or lied to the trial judge, ACT's Chief Justice Lucy McCallum, which is the kind of thing that a barrister can get struck off for. He also found that Drumgold inappropriately withheld evidence or information from the defence team. So, you know, in a criminal prosecution, so that everyone gets a fair trial, it's appropriate for the prosecutor, who generally has more information, to share it with the defence, so that even if it's not admissible ultimately in the trial as evidence, it can sort of help the defence in their inquiries, or it could lead them down a road of inquiry that will be helpful to the defendant. So it's incumbent upon you to, as prosecutor, to share that information. And Drumgold really tried very hard to withhold sort of certain key pieces of evidence that he thought would be quite damning to Brittany Higgins from the defence team, and that was unethical and inappropriate, the inquiry found. It's really crucial to remember as well, and I think this can get lost in the chaos, that the finding of the inquiry was the decision to prosecute in the first place was appropriate and was legitimate.
And what did it find that he lied about?
So this is where, I mean, it's so entangled with the media, it's so entangled with politics, but the original story of Brittany Higgins' alleged rape was broken on television by journalist Lisa Wilkinson on Channel 10, and then separately by Samantha Maiden on news.com. So as a result of that, Lisa Wilkinson, the journalist, was a potential witness who was going to be called at the trial. So as a potential witness, she was called into a meeting with Shane Drumgold before the trial. And as it happened, Lisa Wilkinson was also up for a Logie Award for this interview that she'd done with Brittany Higgins. And she says that during that meeting with prosecutor Shane Drumgold, at which Channel 10 lawyers were present, she said to him, look, I'm up for this award. I'm thinking about giving this speech about this matter. Is it okay if I give this speech? And she said he basically had no objections. Later, she won the award. She gave the speech.
After 40 years in journalism, this interview and this story is by far the most important work I have ever done. And I knew it from the very first phone call I had early last year with a young woman whose name, she told me, was Brittany Higgins.
Which the trial judge and Bruce Lerhmann's defence team argued would be very damaging to his prospects of a fair trial. The trial judge, Lucy McCallum, was absolutely outraged about this speech, and she lambasted Lisa Wilkinson publicly and put back the date of the trial, which is sort of not good for the administration of justice, and it's really not good for complainant or defendant. So Lisa Wilkinson always said that she gave the speech because Shane Drumgold basically sort of said it was okay. Shane Drumgold said that he warned her against the prospect of giving this speech. He made a note, or he said he made a note at the time of that conversation, that meeting with Lisa Wilkinson, and he told the judge that reflected his version of events. And he admitted during the inquiry that actually the note that he made, that he said was contemporaneous, he made very much after the meeting. And so he misled the trial judge, who then went on to kind of lambast Lisa Wilkinson and postpone the trial. And the implication, I suppose, is that during that meeting he should have told Lisa Wilkinson in no uncertain terms that, she should not give any kind of speech that might prejudice the trial, and he didn't do that, and then he was sort of trying to cover his tracks. We should say, though, that Drumgold has denied ever engaging in deliberate or underhanded conduct.
So what you're effectively saying is that the career of this lead prosecutor in this trial of the decade is effectively over That would be surreal enough for one case. But then on Monday, you wrote that the former Supreme Court judge who wrote the report, in which Shane Drumgold has been absolutely, lambasted, that he now faces a possible integrity probe or even legal action as a result of his own actions. So what did he do?
Yeah, so this is Walter Sofronoff, who's a former Supreme Court Justice of Queensland. He's a former Solicitor General of Queensland, and he was tasked by the ACT government to come in and kind of sort out the mess and report on any possible failings of the criminal justice system in order to shore up the system and restore public confidence after this really messy aftermath to the trial. And in fact, what seems to have happened is that during the inquiry, he was meeting with favoured journalists, and this journalist ended up publishing pretty much the entire contents of the inquiry findings.
I mean, this seems like a dark episode of Fawlty Towers or something. So just how remarkable is this? The prospect has been raised that Shane Drumgold, the very person whose job it was to uphold the due process of law, could be charged with perverting the course of justice. And Walter Sofronoff could face separate charges himself.
It's absolutely extraordinary. This whole matter just seems to be like a wrecking ball that absolutely destroys the lives of everyone it touches, journalists, defendant, complainant, and now these sort of high-profile legal figures who've stepped into it and tried to sort of sort out the mess but have been claimed themselves. I mean, the things that Shane Drumgold is found to have done, according to this inquiry, are very serious, particularly for a lawyer, an officer of the court who has very, very strict duties to the court, to the judge, and, to the people of the ACT. So he could be charged with perverting the course of justice, which of course is an extremely serious offence, for misleading the trial judge. And then Walter Sofronoff, because he's inappropriately spoken to journalists and released the inquiry's findings to journalists ahead of giving it to the ACT government, that's actually a possible offence under the provisions of the Act, under the auspices of which he was sort of hired, if you like. So under the Board of Inquiries Act, ACT, it says very clearly that basically the information has to be confidential, given to the ACT government, who then has a bit of a chance to digest it, sit on it, decide what to do with it, and then they table it in Parliament, and that's when the public gets to see it. So it's really quite extraordinary that he would be talking to journalists during the inquiry. And the provision that he appears to have possibly contravened is an offence provision. So it is punishable by penalties. Whether or not the ACT government decides to go down that route and sort of pursue action against him, they're still considering.
Okay, so this report has taken these two very senior scalps, but Shane Drumgold's initial desire for this inquiry was solid. I mean, he wanted it to investigate the broader failings of what he called the chronic problem in Australia with the way our legal institutions deal with allegations of sexual violence. So what does the report teach us about the ACT justice system and how allegations of rape are handled by police?
Yeah. I think that's sort of when you step out of it and look at the more systemic stuff and less focus on the individuals, that you see that there was, and the inquiry found this as well, that there was a really deep divide. There was a lot of police who had doubts about Brittany Higgins' truthfulness, and those doubts about her truthfulness were possibly unconsciously, but were very much communicated to her. She was aware of that when she was going through the process, and that in turn alienated her from the police and from the entire process, and basically caused her to lose confidence in the entire process. And we sort of saw that at the end of the trial when she went out on when the trial was aborted and she went out on the steps of the ACT court and sort of made that speech, which was quite, incendiary and was, quite defiant, basically.
I chose to speak up and share my experiences with others. I told the truth. Today's outcome does not change that truth.
Shane Drumgold's point shouldn't be lost in all of this, which is that an extraordinarily small percentage of rape complaints are ever brought to justice, are ever prosecuted, and that is particularly the case in the ACT. So the ACT had a report out a while ago about its particularly woeful low rate of sexual assault prosecutions. Sexual assault complaints are usually not made. Sexual assaults complaints, when they are made, are notoriously difficult to investigate and notoriously difficult to gather enough evidence for. And then when sexual assault complaints do get to trial, we often see, or we have seen, I would say, in the Brittany Higgins case, the absolute destruction of the complainant themselves and a huge focus on the complainant's behaviour, whether or not it pertains or is even relevant to the alleged offence. That's not to say that defendants don't deserve a fair trial. Of course they do. And Bruce Lerhmann obviously thinks that he didn't get a fair trial and he hasn't had a fair treatment more generally. But I suppose systemically, stepping away from the individual cases, it is more often than not rape complainants or rape victims who get the raw end of the deal, and it's more often than not that perpetrators will be free of consequences and, as Shane Drumgold said in his statement, also not be available for rehabilitation because they never get into the system in the first place.
And I guess to sort of close up, you summed up so beautifully in your column that this latest episode in the saga isn't even close to being the end of what you wrote was the mushroom cloud of litigation that blooms ever outward. So what are we likely to see next?
Yeah, well, there's various legal matters that are still underway. And there's the possibility that Sofronoff and Drumgold will face charges themselves for their various alleged misdoings. In terms of the complainant and the defendant, particularly the defendant who now is, incredibly aggrieved by his treatment at the hands of the media and also at the hands of the prosecution, he is suing Lisa Wilkinson for the original interview that she did with Brittany Higgins back in 2021. He's suing separately Channel 10, which broadcast that interview. He's suing the ABC. The ABC broadcast live the speech that Brittany Higgins gave on the steps of the ACT court after the trial was aborted. He has also signalled that he might sue the ACT government basically for putting him on trial in the first place. And he's released a statement saying his career prospects are obviously very dire. He might never work again. And while he doesn't want to be rich, he would like to have some money and maybe buy a house and also pay back the people who've helped him with his various legal woes. Separately, Linda Reynolds, who the former Defence Material Minister in whose employ Brittany Higgins was when this rape allegedly occurred, she has issued a writ to sue Brittany Higgins herself and Brittany Higgins' partner David Shiraz over some Instagram posts, which Linda Reynolds says defamed her, which is an extraordinary development because Linda Reynolds also feels that her reputation has been thoroughly impugned during this entire saga, because Brittany Higgins always sort of maintained that there was a lot of pressure on her not to report to police from the government and from sort of Linda Reynolds' office. Linda Reynolds has always rejected those claims. That's like 4 or 5 different legal matters which will sort of carry on and keep us reporting, I suppose.
Well, thank you, Jacqueline, for joining us and walking us through this.
You're always welcome.
Late on Tuesday afternoon, ACT Bar Association President Marcus Hassel announced that Shane Drumgold will no longer be able to practice as a barrister in the ACT after the date of his resignation on September 1st. Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.